Okay, well, good evening, everybody. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to present to Burnview the results of the long-running project at Poulnabrone Portal Tomb. As Franjali said, I worked for many years as an archaeologist with the National Monument Service, and I was privileged to work on the conservation of some of our major monuments, including perhaps the most iconic monument, which is Poulnabrone. And it's, I'm sure you're all familiar with the images that really have become symbols of Ireland's ancient past. So without further ado, we'll head in, and I hope to summarize the results and bring you up to date on some current research that's ongoing. Now, I believe there are people tuning in from many parts of the world, so you may not be very familiar with where Poulnabrone is situated. So apologies for those of you who are based in the Burren. But Poulnabrone is located within the Burren region of County Clare, and the Burren, of course, is the largest upland karst region in Ireland, and it's outlined here in the broken white line. Poulnabrone itself is located in the centre. Oops, sorry. I'm trying to use my cursor, but it doesn't seem to be. Oh yes, here we are. Poulnabrone itself is situated on a plateau at about 140 metres above sea level, just about 8 kilometres south of Ballyvaughan Bay, which is here, and just south of one of the main north-south valleys leading into the centre of the Burren. And it's an area that today is followed by the main north-south route through the Burren, that is the road from Ballyvaughan down to Currafin. So what is Poulnabrone? Poulnabrone is a megalithic tomb, that is a tomb built with large stones. In Ireland, there are about 1,500 recorded megalithic tombs and are classified into 4 general categories. You have portal tombs, court tombs, passage tombs. I'm sure you're all familiar with Newgrange and the tombs of the Boyne Valley. They're passage tombs, and wedge tombs. The majority of the tombs, with the exception of the wedge tombs, belong to the Neolithic or the New Stone Age in Ireland. And this is the period when agriculture was introduced to the country, and it spans the period of roughly 4000 BC to about 2500 BC. So Poulnabrone, and for those of you interested in where the name comes from, it's the Irish Poulnabrone, or hollow of the millstone, or the quern, or the grindstone. A lot of people think it's Poulnabrone, the hollow of the sorrows, but in fact that's not correct, which was a surprise to all of us. So Poulnabrone megalithic tomb is in fact a portal tomb. It has all the attributes of a portal tomb. It has a single rectangular chamber, about 2.5 metres long by about 1.3 metres wide. The front of the tomb is marked by 2 well-matched tall portal stones, hence the name portal tomb. And the top of the tomb is covered by a very large capstone that oversails the front of the tomb. At the back here, you can see a large flat slab, and this was originally a subsidiary capstone that was tucked in underneath the back of the large capstone. The entire tomb is surrounded by a low mound of stones, which you can see here is now grass covered. And this is roughly oval in shape surrounding the entire tomb. This is a view of the front of the tomb. You can see the 2 well-matched portal or entrance stones, and of course the very dramatic oversailing capstone. This was taken at sunset at Midsummer's Day some years ago, and the colouring is really very, very fantastic. Here you can see, just if you can see the cursor, you can see the top of a very low sill stone that marks the entrance to the tomb. So the tomb was always open to access. It was never closed off with a door stone, as some of the tombs in other parts of the country are. And just at the back there, you can see the very low back stone of the chamber. You can see it here. Just to show you some other examples of portal tombs, Kilclooney in County Donegal on the top left there, very dramatic capstone, and Fina in County Leitrim, which of course is a much simpler type of tomb, but still follows the same morphology or the same plan. Knockeen in County Waterford and Harlestown in County Carlow. These illustrate the use of a subsidiary capstone, the smaller stone at the back that helps to support the main capstone. So that's the same type of situation that existed originally at Poulnabrone. So why did we excavate at Poulnabrone? The reason was a very dramatic crack that developed at the base of one of the portal or the entrance stone. You can see it here. This crack was originally noticed during the megalithic survey back in the 1950s, but by the early 1980s, it was noted that it was becoming much worse and it was threatening the stabilization of the entire monument. If this portal stone collapsed, the entire monument collapsed. So at the time, the tomb was in private ownership and it had to be taken into the guardianship of the state to allow conservation works to proceed. And this happened in 1985, 86, and the excavations commenced in 1987. It was decided, first of all, many of you who live in the burn may have remembered this structure that was in place for several years. The first job to be done was to raise the capstone ever so slightly to take the weight off the portal stone. And this TP type structure of oak beams was constructed and it stayed in place during the duration of the excavation. It allowed us to operate in safety underneath the capstone. So what we decided to do, because the portal stone was so badly cracked, it was obvious that it was going to have to be either removed completely or repaired. So rather than just excavate a small area around the portal stone, we decided to maximize our return of information, and the entire chamber of the tomb was excavated. This is the plan of the chamber here. Here you can see the two portal stones. These are the side stones. And then this is the large subsidiary capstone that has slipped out at the back. And here you can see the sill stone that marks the entrance to the chamber. So the area in dark gray here is the area excavated. So the entire chamber and an area at the front was excavated, as well as a substantial part of the cairn. You can see the outline of the roughly oval-shaped cairn here. So what did we find? Well, when I was sent from Dublin to excavate, as you know, the tomb is in karst limestone and there's very little soil cover. So my colleagues said they'd see me back in 2 or 3 weeks. So, there'd be nothing to be found. But to our amazement and to our delight, once the loose stones were removed from within the chamber, we immediately began to find disturbed and fragmented human bone. On the right here, you can see the chamber, looking into the chamber after excavation. And you can see how the tomb was, apologies. You can see how the tomb was actually constructed. We discovered that the side stones and the portal stones were literally sitting on the limestone pavement. And the only stone that was wedged into one of the grikes in the limestone was the sill stone. You can see it's slipped into this crevice and it provides lateral support to the portal stones. Here you can see the stump of the cracked portal stone. The upper part of it has been removed for safety reasons. So the stones of the chamber were literally sitting on the limestone, and the capstone was holding it in place, just like a house of cards. And of course, the low mound of stones surrounding it helped to keep everything in place as well. At the front of the chamber, we discovered this box-like feature, what we call a portico. And it's simply a small area that was delineated by slabs set on edge and then backfilled with clay. And this is a unique feature never before recorded for portal tombs. We're not sure whether it's original to the monument or whether it was added at a later stage, but I'll come back to that again at the end when we're discussing the burial rituals and the dating. So from the minute we began to excavate the soil, we discovered, in fact, there was about 22 centimeters depth of stony calcareous soil within the chamber. Fragments of human bone were present from the top to the bottom, and in fact, by the end of the excavation, 15,000 fragments of human bone had been recovered, and 6,000 of those were identified or could be identified. And the reason why only 6,000 of the 15,000 could be identified is that the bones were so badly fragmented. 84% of them were less than a quarter complete. So what we were dealing with was a commingled, jumbled mass of human bone, most of which was highly fragmented. There were no skeletons in articulation. In other words, where you could identify everything in the correct anatomical position. But what we did notice, and I'll be coming back to this again later, is that there was some evidence of patterning of the skulls. The skulls and skull fragments are colored in yellow here. So you can see how they tend to be placed at the side of the chamber. And in fact, one of the skulls, skull 5, which you can see there, I won't use the cursor too much because it keeps hopping the slides back. One of the skulls was protected by the placement of large stones around it. What you can see, you may be able to see 2 areas of blue colored bone. They were the only bones found in articulation. And in other words, the only bones that were in the correct anatomical positioning. There were some vertebrae and some vertebrae and ribs, the lower group of bones. Other than that, all the bones were jumbled together. And in fact, the grike or the crevice that runs through the chamber, that had been cleaned out, and the bones were stuffed, literally stuffed down into the grike to a depth of about 50 centimeters. So you really were talking about a chamber that was chock-a-block full of fragmented human remains. Here you can see, get an idea of how jumbled up the remains were. In the top left photograph there, you can see 2 largely intact skulls with a part of another one at the base of one of the side stones. You can see a hip bone and some mandible. And on the right, you can see large long bones overlying ribs and other bones belonging to a child or adolescent. So the human remains have been analysed in great depth by, and I'd like to pay tribute to Barrow O'Donovan and Mara Tesorieri from University College Cork and Jessica Beckett from Cambridge University, all who have looked at the remains and given us information about different aspects of the collection. What we do know from the analysis is that we have at least 36 individuals, 19 adults and 17 sub-adult. We have male and female, and we have all age groups from fetus right up to older adult. And older adult apparently is anybody 55 or over. Now, the initial analysis of the bones, those that could be actually sexed as male or female, there was roughly equal male and female. But as ancient DNA is now being used in research projects on the collection, there seems to be more of a bias towards male, but there are still quite a few females in the collection. All the bones were unburnt, although some of them were scorched, and I'll be coming back to that again later. The interesting thing is that there was an underrepresentation of long bones and skulls. In other words, for even 36 individuals, you would expect so many skulls and so many long bones, but we don't have enough long bones and skulls for 36 individuals. So what is happening here is that bones over the centuries are being removed from the chamber. The long bones that were removed, a lot of them were exposed to fire and were scorched and then were broken and returned to the tomb. So there is a lot of manipulation of the remains taking place after burial. But the burial rite that did take place is that you have successive interments. In other words, complete bodies were put into the stony soil, allowed to decompose, and then subsequent burials that were put in disturbed the earlier burials. And that's very important when we come to the dating of the construction of the tomb, the fact that it is successive burials we're talking about. Because at one stage we wondered whether, in fact, all of these bones were removed from an original burial place somewhere else and transported to Poulnabrone. But in fact, that is not the case for certain reasons, because we have the very small bones from the feet and the hands, which would not normally survive such movement. There's no evidence of the bones being left exposed elsewhere. And also we do have a few bones in articulation, which does point to the fact that the bodies were put in whole and then subsequently disturbed, manipulated, and moved around. But I'll be coming back to that again when we're talking about the actual rituals that may have taken place. At the entrance to the tomb, here you can see the sillstone and the portico feature at the front. A third trimester fetus was discovered in that little junction of the two grikes, that little pocket in the bedrock. It was buried together with fragments of pottery. So that's the only burial from the portico feature. So having this amount of human bone allows us to gain insights into the lifestyle of the people of Poulnabrone. It doesn't come as any surprise that they lived very hard physical lives, and osteoarthritis was a major problem. On the top left there, you can see some vertebrae that were very badly affected by osteoarthritis. They also had arthritis of the wrist and the hands, particularly of the left hand, which suggests that a lot of the people who are buried here were left-handed, or they used their left hand for more physical activities than the right. Also, the pathology tells us that they engaged in portage using the top of their back, their neck, and top of the head. In other words, they carried heavy loads on their heads and in their upper back and on their neck. They had very good dental health. There's only one example of caries in all the teeth that were recovered. But there was also evidence of interpersonal violence or trauma. And in the skull on the top right, you can see arrowed there a circular depression in the skull, which must have been caused by a very hard blow from from a round object, probably a stone of some sort. Below the skull, you can see a rib that has been fractured but then healed. And apparently where that fracture is, it's unlikely to have been caused by a fall, but is more likely to have been caused by a blow to the chest. And then on the bottom left is the most dramatic example of interpersonal violence, and that is the hip bone of a male adult with the tip of a church arrowhead embedded in the top of his hip. Now, this arrow would have been shot from above and behind on the left-hand side of the person, who I presume was running from the assailant. And because the bone has not healed in any way around the wound, we know that this individual died shortly after he was attacked. This wound would not have been the cause of death, so the poor individual probably had many other injuries as well. So examination of the bone can tell us so much about the lives of the people who were buried in the tomb. Stable isotope analysis was also carried out. I won't go into the science of this, but by looking at the bone collagen of the mandibles and the tooth enamel, we can actually determine what sort of geology was in the area where these people spent their very early years, because the groundwater leaves signatures in the mineralization of teeth. And what transpired is that all except one of the people who were looked at from Poulnabrone grew up in limestone area. Presumably, we're talking about the burn. So they were native to the burn, but there was one blow-in, probably from East Galway, the Slieve Orty area of East Galway, but more work needs to be done on the actual database, stable isotope database for Ireland to be definite about this. What the stable isotope analysis also showed was that these people had a largely terrestrial diet and had a limited consumption of animal protein, and it appears that plant proteins were dominant. Now, the largely terrestrial diet during the Neolithic is something that is coming out of other research in Britain and in Europe. So the hunter-gatherer people who preceded the Neolithic farmers would have had a very heavy reliance on marine resources. But when the Neolithic, when the farming was introduced, domesticated animals, cultivation of crops, people seem to have turned their backs on marine resources, which is rather unusual. And here at Poulnabrone, it appears that plant proteins rather than animal proteins were dominant. Presumably animals, domesticated animals were highly prized and that they preferred, you know, they kept them for special occasions, and for milk, we know that certainly dairy products were used at this time, and perhaps for traction. So plant proteins seem to be dominant for their diet. Together with the human remains, there were about 42 or 43 artifacts or grave goods buried with the people, and there were about 100 very tiny fragments of pottery. Unfortunately, the pottery was very degraded. We have about 30 stone implements, and here you can see a selection. On the left-hand side are the Neolithic arrowheads and scrapers. These were all made from chert, which would have been found locally within the limestone. On the right, we have artifacts that are more commonly found in the early Bronze Age, and we do have some evidence of, as you'll see later, of some early Bronze Age activity at the site. Now, microware analysis was carried out on these artifacts, and it was concluded that they were used mostly for the whittling and shaving of wood and plant remains, and very little was used for skinning of hides or for cutting of meat, which actually ties in with the story that's coming from the stable isotope analysis. So again, you can, the specialists can look at this material and give us a lot of information about the lifestyle of the people involved. What was also interesting was that all of these stone tools were very, had been used very, very much. They were all quite worn. So I think we're looking at the toolkits of the people who were buried in the tomb. Other, I suppose, more exotic artifacts. On the top right, you have 2 stone disc beads. And again, these are commonly found during the Neolithic and would have been used for personal adornment. These would have been made from glacial pebbles found locally. The 2 quartz crystals, they were probably treasured for their reflectivity, and I suppose could have had some symbolism, because even today, you find quartz pebbles scattered on modern graves, and there seems to be symbolism relating to remembrance and death when it comes to crystals. On the left, we have a polished stone axed, a very fine example, but this is made from a stone called dacite, which is not found locally or in Ireland, and is probably comes from the northeast of England, the Cumbrian region. And remains of a second stone axe of dacite was also recovered. And this indicates that there was some long distance communication and trade taking place at this time. Here we have 2 very fine little pieces. On the left, we have half of what's known as a barbell toggle. This is made from bone, and it's just half, the other half is missing. But the shaft of the barbel is so fine and so delicate, I don't think it could have been used to tie pieces of clothing. And I'm arguing that perhaps it was used for hair decoration, you know, to wrap the hair around it, as some bobbins are used today. On the right is the piece de resistance, my favorite piece of the whole assemblage. This is a bone pendant. It's actually very small. If you look at the scale, it's just about 2 centimeters in length. And this is unique and is without parallel anywhere that I can find in Britain, Ireland, or indeed prehistoric Europe. And I think it illustrates very clearly great creative design and attention to detail, with the central row of perforations, and then on each side you have little depressions cut into the surface of the pendant. If you notice, the top perforation is slightly elongated and worn, and this would be from suspension on whether it was a leather thong or whatever they used to actually suspend it. It is quite polished, and I think was heavily worn, and was probably in circulation for some time, and must have been a prized possession of somebody buried in the tomb. But it's a very fine artifact. I should say that most of these artifacts are on display in the Clare County Museum in Ennis, for anybody who is interested. Together with the human remains, there were animal bones found, about 700 fragments. Finbar McCormick has analysed these, and we have domesticates, including cattle, pig and sheep, goat, and then we have wild dog, fox, hare, stoat, pine marten, wood marten and birds. The domesticates, a lot of those have been dated, and they do belong to the Neolithic period. But the interesting thing is that they are all very young animals. So in other words, we're talking about calves, piglets and lambs, or kid, the sheep goat. And Finbar suggested that perhaps these are ritual firstling offerings made at the time of burial, or he suggests maybe it is much more mundane explanation, and that is that these young animals took refuge in the tomb and actually died there. So we don't know whether it's part of the ritual that surrounded the burial, or whether there's a more mundane explanation. There's no evidence that any of them were butchered, and there was no domestic waste. So definitely they are not food waste. So one of the big research questions that we had was, can we date the construction of the tomb and the period of usage of the tomb? At the time when I did the excavation, very little was known about portal tombs. Very few had been excavated, and those that had produced very little. In fact, Poulnabrone is still the only portal tomb that has produced unburnt human remains. Some cremations have been found in other tombs, but a lot of those are found to be secondary insertions in the tomb. So dating the construction of the tomb is very important. There was a debate about the relationship between portal tombs and court tombs, because there is a lot of similarity between the material culture in both of those types of megaliths. And there were arguments, are we talking development from simple to complex, because the court tombs are quite complex, or is it vice versa? So dating Poulnabrone would have been very, very important. So the first burials to be the earliest burials in the tomb dated to about 3,800 BC. And we know that there was intermittent burial continued until about 3,200 BC. So it was in use intermittently for about 600 years. Now the early dates around 3,800, in fact, some of them are almost 3,850, means that the earliest burials belong to the very earliest period of the Neolithic in Ireland, which is generally dated to beginning around 3,900 or thereabouts. So we're talking about very, very early in the Neolithic. And because we know that the people who were buried there spent their youth in the burn, they must be at least the second generation from the very earliest people who came into the burn. So this is very important in terms of the chronology of megalithic tombs. And at the moment, Poulnabrone is the very earliest dated megalith in Ireland. I think it's only a matter of time before other portal tombs and will be seen to belong to a similar period. But at the moment, because of the wonderful organic remains that we have been able to get, we now have almost 50 radiocarbon dates from the tomb, which is the best dated tomb, certainly in the country. We have evidence of a little early Bronze Age activity. We have, I think, one or two of the animal bones, and we have a few fragments of human bone that date to the early Bronze Age or Chalcolithic period. So even though the tomb burial really ceased at around 3200, it still was obviously a special place right through the early Bronze Age, and there was the odd little bit of activity and burial at that later time. The fetus burial was later again, about 1500 BC, so you're talking about the Middle Bronze Age. So what this means is, as I was saying, that we are talking about the very, very early Neolithic Poulnabrone was constructed. Another debate that was raging was the introduction of agriculture. Was it an introduction of ideas with a limited number of people, and that the indigenous Mesolithic people actually adopted agricultural way of life? Or was there migration of large numbers of people actually coming into the country? Now, if you were talking, here you can see all of the sites marked with the colored dots. They're all Neolithic monuments. The only Mesolithic remains, and Elaine will know this well, is the shell middens that are found on the west coast, particularly at Fenor Moor, excavated by Michael Lynch here. And definitely there is Mesolithic activity on the coast here. But within the central burn area, at the moment, we have no Mesolithic sites. So it's reasonable to argue that the builders of Poulnabrone and the other Neolithic monuments within the burn were people who came in from outside. And as you'll see, the current research in DNA is supporting that argument. So we have to remember that at the time the tomb was constructed, the environment was very different to what it is today. We know from pollen analysis in the general burn area that at this time there was heavy woodland, including pine, oak, elm, and a lot of hazel. But we know from, unfortunately, there was no pollen surviving in the grikes or crevices at the tomb itself. But the analysis of the snails indicated that there were certainly some open rocky habitats in the general area, as well as undisturbed woodland. So we're talking about the tomb being constructed in an opening within heavily wooded area. So people have argued that because portal tombs are quite dramatic in elevation, if you look at them from the side, that maybe there were route markers. That was one of the suggestions. But if you're in a heavily wooded area, you're not going to actually see the monument until you're in very close proximity. And Phyllis Mercer, who has carried out a lot of research on the Irish portal tombs, has concluded that in fact the portal tombs were built in more secluded areas and that they weren't making dramatic statements in the landscape. What must have been a critical factor in the decision to place the tomb where it is the presence of standing water only 30 meters from the tomb. This is a spring, fresh water, and it is the only standing water in this part of the high burn. And again, this proximity to water sources is a common attribute of portal tombs in Ireland. They're always constructed in close proximity to either streams, rivers, or other water sources. So whatever rituals were carried out at the tomb, water must have played some important part in it. It must have had, water is seen as the source of life, and it plays a major part in all symbolic and spiritual rituals and ceremonies. So the presence of the water, I think, can explain as well why the tomb is where it is. So what about the rituals and the people who were buried? We know that the tomb was used for a period of, intermittently over a period of about 600 years. We know that we have, well, minimum of 36 individuals, but even if it was considerably more, we're still talking about 24 generations roughly. And the burial of this number of people cannot represent a whole community. So we're talking about some selection process being in place to determine who could be buried within the tomb. And this is something that we can only speculate about. Because there were men, women, and children, I initially argued that these must have been tribal or familial groupings, and that this was a kind of a family tomb. But as you can see, as we'll see from the DNA now, a different story is beginning to emerge. But I think there must have been some element of ancestor devotion, perhaps because the tomb was built at the very early stages of the introduction of agriculture. Perhaps it kind of retained reminders of the people who first arrived, with the seeds, with the animals, and who cleared the woodland, and it continued to be a kind of a remembrance of those ancestors. That's a possibility. Coming back to the ritual, the burial ritual, as I mentioned, the underrepresentation of skulls and long bone is very interesting, because it is clear that a lot of bone was removed from the tomb during the period of usage. We know that the long bones, and you can see some on the left here, when they were taken out of the tomb, they were exposed to heat and fire, and they became scorched. They were subsequently broken and returned to the tomb, but not all of them. So we're thinking in terms of bones being removed and perhaps being held as relics of ancestors, and perhaps being passed amongst the different communities within the area. And then some of the bones are returned to the tomb, but not all of them. The treatment of the skulls, as I mentioned earlier, appears to be quite special, and that they were packed around the edge of the chamber. There was a preponderance of toe and finger bones in the grike, in the main grike, the crevice that runs through the chamber. So there's some element of patterning, manipulation going on during the period of usage of the tomb. And we can only begin to kind of guess at what all of this means. So finally, the ongoing research. I should say that the results of the project, the details were published in 2014. And I thought, well, that's kind of the story of Poulnabrone. But I did say in my discussion that perhaps in time, the recovery of ancient DNA would tell us a little bit more about the people and their social structures. Little did I think that 6 years later, in fact, huge strides would have been made, and that we are now getting information about the people, the earliest farmers in the Burren, that we could only have dreamt about. So the survival of ancient DNA is best in the petrous bone. Now, the petrous bone is one of the bones in the middle ear. And luckily in Poulnabrone, because of the excellent survival of the bone, DNA survives, excellent preservation of DNA has occurred. In fact, Lara Cassidy, who has done a lot of this, most of this work, in fact, says that the quality of the DNA from Poulnabrone is almost as good as modern DNA. It's really, really excellent. So the results that, and this is ongoing research, I should say, the genomes or the DNA derived mostly from sources that ultimately originated in Anatolia or in Turkey. And the migration of early farmers came westward from Anatolia, probably from the Iberian Peninsula. At the moment, the closest parallel for the DNA or the genetics of the Poulnabrone people are in Neolithic Spain. At the moment, that's the closest parallel that we have, but they would have come ultimately from Anatolia. So here we have early agriculturalists moving westward through via Iberia, and then they would have made their way up to Ireland. Now, we don't have a detailed genetic narrative, if you like, of Spain, France, England, and Ireland is sufficiently detailed to say which way precisely how they arrived in Ireland. For a long time, there was not a whole lot of ancient DNA research being done in France, but this is now, in fact, changing. And the most recent results could suggest that northwest France, that came from Iberia to northwest France and then across to Ireland. But whether it was via Britain or whether they came direct to Ireland, that's something that eventually we should be able to work out, or the scientists will be able to work out. This is all part of a pan-European program of ancient DNA analysis. And Poulnabrone is playing a huge part in that. In fact, it's of international importance because of what it's providing. Another interesting feature is that there's no evidence of admixture with indigenous hunter-gatherers. In other words, there's no evidence in the genetic makeup of the Poulnabrone farmers of mixing with indigenous hunter-gatherers. So they're quite a separate group of people. Another very interesting thing, and something that took us totally by surprise, is that there's no familial relationship to the fourth degree. In other words, there are no direct relationships between the people buried to the fourth degree. In other words, first, second, third, fourth cousins. There is no relationship that close. So that means we're not talking about a family or tribal site, a ritual site, but it also means that the migration was large enough that we had outbreeding communities. So in other words, they didn't have to inbreed within their own community. There were sufficient numbers of people where they could actually breed with others, other distant groups. Parknabinia, which is about 8 kilometers from Poulnabrone, it's an atypical court tomb, which was excavated by Carlton Jones and is currently being prepared for publication. And it has similar survival of human remains. Even though it's that close to Poulnabrone and its usage overlaps with Poulnabrone, there is very little kinship with Parknabinia. There is some distant kinship, but there are genetic differences between the males. So even though within 8 or 10 kilometers, we have people using a tomb with different morphology, and they appear to be of different genetic makeup. So we have different groups using different types of tombs. Perhaps the most poignant of all the results coming through from Poulnabrone is the discovery of an infant of a few months old with evidence of Down syndrome. This is the earliest known record of Down syndrome in the world, as far as we know to date. It's also interesting that this infant had a signature of being breastfed, again, which gives us an insight into the social care being taken within the community that used Poulnabrone in this very, very early period of time. Because the Poulnabrone DNA is so well preserved, they are doing whole genome analysis of quite a few of the individuals. And as I said, this work is ongoing, but we're beginning to see even get an insight into what they looked like. Now, the illustration on the left was used in my book, and I used it, I had it made up to just show how perhaps some of the personal adornments would have been used. I've just put it in here to remind us that we're talking about people, and the DNA analysis is telling us something about the skin color, which is on the left here. And you can see that pale to intermediate and then dark, but the majority are intermediate or pale skinned. And this is a little bit different to the Mesolithic people that have been looked at, which appear to have been much darker skinned. The middle block is hair color, and you can see how it's very dark brown, nearly black, some two are lighter. And then on the right, you have eye color. So largely brown eyes with a few lighter. So we're beginning to even see what these people looked like, as well as how they lived. And this is really, really exciting research. I think it's going to revolutionize our view of prehistory and the sort of social context in which these people lived their lives. So just to finish up, to say Poulnabrone is different things to different people, but certainly having spent a lot of time there at all hours of day in the evening, people who come still, I think, commune with nature, and they still feel something spiritual and some connection with their ancestors when they're at the site. And of course, it is a very, very heavily visited tourist attraction, and that brings with it all sorts of other management and conservation issues, which I won't go into tonight, but which Brendan Dunford of Burn Bio was very active in helping us when we were coming up with a management plan for the actual area around Poulnabrone, because shortly after the excavations were completed, the state purchased the monument and a large area surrounding it so that it could be presented more or less in its proper landscape and environment. So just to acknowledge all those who helped, and there's too numerous just to list out, but especially the scientists and specialists. And the photography is by Con Brogan of the National Monument Service. And of course, the National Monument Service funded the entire project from beginning to end. So if there are any questions, I will do my best to try and answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. That was absolutely beautiful. And you stuck to the time so well. I mean, I can't believe you packed in so much in the 50 minutes that you spoke, and some absolutely fascinating things that we learned about. I won't take much time that we have to give for questions. Elaine, do you want to start by asking a question or two?
Will I stop sharing now?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I hate this technology.
Oh, and that was, oh my God, that was fascinating. There's so much information from that talk. It was absolutely, I do have a quick question myself before I go to look at the other questions. You know, the hip bone.
Yeah.
Were you able to, did you ever remove the tip of the arrowhead? Was it?
No. It was X-ray, so we have the shape of it from the X-ray. To remove it, actually, you would split the hip bone. In fact, it hit the hip bone with such force that the tip has come out the other side and has actually split the bone a little bit. So no, we would never attempt to remove it.
So there's no way of, with the X-ray, it wasn't possible to see what it kind of came from. Like, was it a Neolithic arrowhead or a Mesolithic arrowhead? You
see, it's only the very tip.
Yeah. So
I don't think you'd be able to say what shape arrowhead it was. No, I don't think you'd be able to do that actually.
Okay, my last bit of question now, and I will move on. Did you ever date that hip bone? Did that hip bone get dated?
No, that particular one isn't dated. No.
Okay.
No.
Anyway, there's a good few questions now here. Someone was actually asked, you've actually loads of people from, there's people from Connecticut, Florida.
I saw Dublin.
That. Yeah, Carolina.
Amazing.
Yeah, the Burn Yoga Resort and Retreat, sorry, is here too. Someone was asking, they were saying, thanks for clarifying the meaning of the name Poulnabrone. This is from Hugh Carthy. He was just wondering, what's the source of that information?
Oh, it's the Place Names Commission, which is the official source for place name translation.
Oh yeah, very good. And then Hugh Carthy was asking, do we know when our ancestors began to move out of Anatolia?
Oh, well, it took, yeah, let me see. It certainly was around the 9000 BC. I can't actually give a precise date, but it took several thousand years for the transition from Anatolia across the Mediterranean into Iberia and then north. So reaching Britain around the late 4th millennium. But now it's looking like it got to Western Ireland about the same time as they're talking about it meeting Britain. So I'm wondering, did some agriculturalists come directly to Ireland, you know, from northwest France, perhaps from Brittany, or maybe directly from Iberia up along the coast and across. But we need more dates, you know, in order to really fine tune the actual progression, migration west. So I can't give you an absolute date of the dates in Anatolia, but I know it took several thousand years.
Brilliant. Somebody was just asking the DNA from the DNA studies, is there anybody related to modern Burn residents?
They haven't, not to my knowledge, and nothing like that has come out of it so far. But then I don't know whether they have done much DNA analysis of modern Burn populations. I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Yeah, I think that we'll know more when we do more DNA. Yeah, it's completely changing archaeology, especially the movement.
I should say that obviously there was huge migration in at the beginning of the Neolithic. We now know that. So it was people who came in as well as the knowledge of agriculture and so on. And there's evidence of another major migration in the early Bronze Age, and that came from more northern steppe area, northern Europe. So there are two different migrations. And then of course you have the intermingling thereafter, you know, so it's quite a complex picture that's emerging.
And there's just one more question. How deep was the soil where the burials were made? So I suppose,
about 20 to 22 centimeters. So it's not very deep.
No, but they packed a lot in. And I was wondering, you know, so you just again, sorry now, before, in case anyone else wants to ask any more questions, pop them in really quickly. You know, what you were suggesting, so does it look like that they put in the complete human remains inside to decompose and then took them out again?
Yeah, we know that they put in complete bodies and they allowed them to decompose. And then as other burials were put in, obviously the previous ones were disturbed, you know, as you're putting in, because you're talking about a very small chamber and you're talking about not a great depth of soil. But then at some stage throughout that period of time, they also began to remove bones, dry bones. So once they had decomposed, they began to remove certain bones, but they seemed to focus on skulls and long bones. They were the bones that were removed. And some of the long bones were exposed to heat, and we know that they were exposed when they were dry. By the way, you know, those who analyze the bone can tell you whether the bones were fleshed or defleshed. So the bones were dry when they were actually exposed to heat, when they were scorched. So there's obviously something going on outside when they removed them to do with fire. There must have been some sort of ceremonies or some sort of rituals or whatever. And then the long bones were broken, fragmented, and returned to the tomb. And not because we don't have enough long bones to go with the numbers that we have. I see somebody says there we have left-handed vegans in Poulnabrone. I think that's right.
Sorry, now I missed the questions. There's actually other questions here. But
I just distill them into a few, Elaine, and there's a few repetitions. So I might just choose the ones that are repeated quite often. How did you end up repairing the cracked stone, the portal stone? Oh
yes, I should have said that. Initially, it was hoped that the stone could be repaired and dowelled together. But in fact, the base of the stone was very badly cracked. It was cracked in several places and it was deemed unsuitable for repair. So it was removed and a new stone, a new portal stone was taken from the pavement just close to the tomb, almost exactly the same shape. And that was inserted, and this is all recorded. And the original stone is actually at the site beside the cairn and can still be seen. And what that showed us really is how easy it was, in one sense, to construct the monument, because the limestone pavement, the clints of the pavement are slabs of limestone that are quite easily prized off. And there you have the actual shapes that you need for your side stones. And in fact, the capstone of the tomb is a complete clint. You can see some of the same shape in the general area. And, you know, it showed us how easy it was to actually remove the stone from the pavement and move it using rollers and ropes to the site and erect it. So the stone has been replaced. A new stone has been put in its place. In fact, another crack has recently developed in one of the other side stones, so it's an ongoing problem.
Okay, thanks for that. That's a very good answer. Somebody's asking, Pauline said, delighted to hear about the infant with Down syndrome and also that the child was breastfed, so was being cared for and loved, not abandoned. Paul is asking, do you have any publications available for the general public that is not specialist journals that are hard to access?
Well,
I know you have your own book. I should mention Anne has written her own book, Poulnabrone, an early Neolithic portal tomb.
Yeah, and it's actually, it is the detailed publication, but it is actually quite readable. Sorry, I have just something coming up here about scams. It is, it's not expensive. And I'm sure Prinjali will be able to give the details. This Poulnabrone, an early Neolithic portal tomb in Ireland, and it was published, it's government publications in 2014. So that's really the main publication. There's no shorter publication at the moment on the tomb, I'm afraid.
Very good. Okay, thanks, Anne. For those who want to learn more, maybe get the hold of that book. Niall is asking, has any location other than Ireland practiced the same sites? I presume he means have they found similar kind of sites in other places outside of Ireland?
Well, in terms of portal tombs, it's very much in Irish, Western Britain. There's some in Western Britain, and they haven't been excavated very much. And the problem is that a lot of those that are excavated are in acid soil, so you do not have the preservation of the human bone. And this is where the burn comes into its own. Because of the limestone geology, you have wonderful preservation of human bone, and really that's where the research tells the story. But in terms, I mean, in Britain, there are lots of different types of Neolithic monuments, and there's one particular one, Hazelton North, which is a long barrow with two tombs almost back to back in the mound. And they've recently published results of ancient DNA done there, and it's very interesting. It's very different to Poulnabrone in that each of the two tombs belongs to a different male lineage. So, you know, different lineages had different tombs within the same site. And I think there they had something like 5 generations of descendants from the one female. So it was very much a family line in each tomb. So there's a lot going on right across Europe at the moment. It's really racing ahead, this whole research. It's hard to keep up, actually.
Fantastic. Anonymous question, was the fetus found from the same period?
No, that was much later. It was 1500 BC. So it was nearly 2000 years later.
Okay. I think Maria Long is asking, could you mention a little bit about what was put back and how?
Yes, well, all the finds and the human remains are curated. They're currently in the National Museum facility in Swords in County Dublin. The main finds are on loan to the Ennis Museum, the Clare County Museum in Ennis. So in terms of, well, the clay has obviously been put back, but none of the artifacts are obviously put back. They're all curated. Either, well, those that are in the Clare County Museum are on loan from the National Museum.
Okay, very good. I might just ask the last question before maybe Elaine has another question. Karen Van Dorp has asked, what are your ideas about the curious arrangement of finger and toe bones in the Grieg? Could they have ended up there by themselves? Thank you.
No, I think there were so many of the finger and toe bones put into the Grieg. It could not have been done by accident. And also, they would have to have, they couldn't have fallen in, because the Grieg was originally filled with clay. That was cleaned out, and the bones were actually stuffed down, literally stuffed down into the Grieg. Why, I have no idea. I don't think it could have happened by accident. And those who analysed the bones said, no, it's too much of a coincidence to have so many finger and foot bones in the Grieg. It's just one of those curious patterning.
It's just so interesting. Even the animal remains, you mentioned that there's a lot of baby animals there, and a remarkably high number of hairs for some reason. It just...
well, we actually found a hair snare.
Okay.
In the tomb. That was the only modern, well, apart from on the very surface, we had coke tins and various things, but the only modern find actually, and we could see where hairs don't burrow, they don't, but there was a little bit of kind of scratching and a little bit of a depression, and the snare was found, copper wire snare in the tomb.
Yeah, and the fact that they weren't butchered, so presumably they were either put there live or they ended up there somehow.
Yeah,
So many unanswered questions. That's fascinating. Elaine, do you want to ask any last questions before we wind up?
I suppose maybe just the fact that they weren't related, the individuals weren't actually directly related. That seemed to be for all of the individuals in the, I suppose we kind of think like, when I think about it, it's like, oh, how are they not related? Do you know what I mean?
Well, now the first thing, of course, is remember that these are spread over a long period of time. They're not all belonging to 100-year period. You're talking about spread over 600 years. So that's one reason why you can have distant relationship rather than close. But the other, I mean, that is a pattern that's coming up in Britain as well. And apart from Hazelton North that I just mentioned, but some of the sites in Britain are showing the same, that it just shows that there was sufficiently large communities, again, which gives us some idea about maybe population sizes. Eventually we might be able to, hazard a guess. There were sufficiently large groups of people that they could actually breed outside their own immediate families.
Yeah, no, it's just fascinating, and I look forward to what more you're going to find out from the site. It just seems to be ongoing, the information that's coming out of it. It's just amazing. I mean, to think that you excavated it back in, was it 95? Was 97?
No, the late 80s.
Oh, in the late 80s. Listen, I mean, it's just, I've been following it and myself, and it's just, every time as an archaeologist, it's just like even that little bit of information, and that there was more people than we actually thought that there would have been at that time. So it's just absolutely amazing to keep following it. So I do look forward to seeing what's else is going to pop out from Poulnabrone. Such a significant site in Ireland as well, and to have it in the Burn as well is, it's just brilliant.
It's an amazing site,
Yeah, thanks a million.
It's an amazing site. As somebody mentioned, it's a site that keeps on giving. There's so much,
that's true.
there.
That's true.
So many stories yet to come out.
It really does.
Well, thanks very much, Anne and Elaine. That was absolutely wonderful, and we have recorded this session, so it'll be available on our YouTube channel, and it'll be a wonderful resource for people who couldn't attend tonight. So with that, I'll just a huge thank you again. Have a very good night, and our next webinar is on Wednesday, on 13th of April, with Rosso Muldoon. He'll be talking about Rowan and Knockloon, a tale of two Burren Hills. So we look forward to that, and thank you very much, and have a very good evening.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Night.
Good night, bye, Anne.
Bye.
Night.